The square is choking with noise, a sea of bodies pressing forward for a better look. The August sun glares mercilessly. But it is not the heat that makes the air stifling. It is the anticipation, morbid, feverish, that clings to every breath. At the centre of Smithfield stands a man bound in chains, dragged through filth until his body is battered and bloodied. Yet his eyes burn with something terrible, something unbroken. He should already be dead, and yet he lives, waiting for a fate designed to strip him of everything human. Horses stamp against the cobblestones, the stench of sweat and dung rising from the streets. The crowd murmurs in excitement, then falls to silence as the executioner approaches. The condemned man is William Wallace, rebel warrior legend. For years his very name had been spoken in whispers across the countryside, a beacon of resistance against England's king. Now he is naked, shackled, humiliated, forced to listen as the mob that once feared him howls for his suffering. They expect blood. They expect a spectacle. They expect to watch a man broken limb by limb until only scraps remain. But Wallace does not lower his head. Even as he is chained to a wooden hurdle dragged through London's mud by horses, his lips move in silence. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. His tormentors believe they are about to erase him from history. What they cannot understand is that brutality can kill a man, but it cannot kill the fire he ignited. Still in this moment, there is no glory, no comfort, only a body about to be torn apart in ways no human imagination dares linger on. And so we must ask, how does a man once celebrated as a hero of his people, come to such an end? Not a clean execution, not a soldier's death, but a horror so deliberate, so methodical, that its cruelty echoes across centuries. To be dragged, to be hanged, yet denied death to feel steel cut open his belly while his heart still beats. Why did Edward, the mighty King of England, design such a fate for this single Scotsman? What did Wallace do that made his punishment so much more than mere death? Tonight we descend into that nightmare. We will retrace the steps from triumph to betrayal, from battlefield to scaffold. We will enter the damp cells where Wallace waited, hear the hollow pronouncements of his so-called trial, and walk with him through the streets of London toward the unthinkable. His end was not just execution, it was theatre. A theatre of cruelty staged to send a message. This is what happens to those who defy a king. But history has its own way of mocking kings. Because even here, at the threshold of Wallace's destruction, we are left with a haunting truth. Chains can bind flesh, knives can cut through muscle fire, can consume organs, but no ruler, no matter how powerful, can wholly silence the cry of a people's will to be free. Before the smell of burning flesh, before the roar of London's jeering crowds, there was a different world, a world where William Wallace stood tall not as a prisoner, but as a hero. To understand the magnitude of his fall, we must return to the days when Scotland was not yet a broken land, but a wounded nation still clinging to its pride. The Highlands rolled endlessly, a tapestry of heather and mist, where every glen whispered of ancient clans and old blood. In these rugged landscapes, Wallace found not only his home but his calling. He was not born into royalty, not raised in a castle of stone, but in a countryside where iron was forged by the hand, where loyalty was measured not by oaths to kings, but by bonds of kinship. To the English crown, Scotland was a territory to be subdued. To Wallace, it was sacred soil, every blade of grass worth a life, every stream worth a war. And in those early years, he proved himself more than just a rebel. He was a warrior who carried with him the raw, untamed fury of his people. Stirling Bridge in 1297 was his masterpiece, a moment when Scotland, small and fractured, rose up like a lion against the might of England. Picture it, the English army, confident and well-armed, forced to cross a narrow bridge. Wallace and his men, waiting silent, hidden. Then the trap is sprung. Horses trample each other in panic. Soldiers drown in the River Forth, and the proud English host crumbles into chaos. For the first time, the impossible seemed within reach, freedom. In that victory, Wallace tasted glory. He was named Guardian of Scotland, a title that made him more than a mere commander. He was the living embodiment of defiance. Ballads were sung of him. Mothers whispered his name to children at night. For a moment, Scotland had a champion who seemed larger than life. But power, like the sun, casts long shadows. Scotland's nobles, whose veins carried as much ambition as blood, looked at Wallace not with admiration, but with suspicion. He was not of their world, not polished by courtly manners, not a man who bowed easily to hierarchy. To the aristocracy, he was dangerous not because he fought the English, but because he reminded the people of a truth long buried, that courage not bloodline makes a leader. And so even in triumph, Wallace's cage was being gilded. He held the title of Guardian, but it was a throne made of fragile glass. He stood at feasts where nobles clinked goblets in his honor, yet their eyes studied him with a hunger that spoke of betrayal. He walked in halls where loyalty was pledged with words, but poisoned with silence. It is this contrast we must hold in our minds. William Wallace, the Lion of Stirling, robed in the glory of his people's love, standing atop the fragile height of power. Because it is only by seeing him there, in the fleeting heaven of victory, that we can understand the depths of the hell into which he would later be cast. The higher the climb, the more devastating the fall. Victory is a fragile crown, and Wallace wore it for only a fleeting moment before the weight began to crush him. Scotland, though emboldened by Stirling Bridge, was still bleeding. And Edward the Hammer of the Scots was not a man to lick his wounds quietly. From the south he gathered his strength, vowing not merely to defeat Wallace, but to obliterate the very idea of Scottish defiance. The first cracks appeared not on the battlefield, but in the whispers of Scotland's own nobility. Men who had once marched beside Wallace began to drift away, their loyalty shifting like reeds in the wind. Some feared Edward's wrath, others lusted for favour from the English crown, but most resented Wallace's rise. He was not of their world. He was a commoner elevated above them, a man of the people daring to command lords whose titles stretched back centuries. Their envy was a slow poison seeping into every corner of his fragile guardianship. Then came Falkirk. July 1298. Edward himself led his army north, a host so vast it seemed to darken the horizon. Wallace arranged his men in schiltrons, great circles of spearmen bristling like hedgehogs of iron. It was a strategy born of desperation, brilliant but fragile. For hours the Scots held their pikes, thrusting back English cavalry in waves. The ground shook with the cries of men and horses, the air choked with dust and blood. For a moment it seemed the impossible might happen again. But betrayal cuts deeper than any sword. The Scottish cavalry, commanded by nobles who despised Wallace, abandoned the field. Whether by cowardice or collusion, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving the spearmen to face Edward's army alone. Arrows rained down, shields splintered, formations broke. The schiltrons collapsed, and with them collapsed Scotland's fragile dream. Wallace escaped with his life, but the victory at Stirling was erased in fire and blood. From that day forward, his crown of glory turned to thorns. The nobles forced him to resign as guardian. He became once more a fugitive, hunted across moor and forest, clinging to shadows. His name remained on the lips of the common people, whispered like a prayer, but among Scotland's lords he was already marked for ruin. The English tightened their grip. Castles fell, villages burned, and every tree seemed to whisper with spies. Wallace could no longer fight in open battle. Instead, He moved like a ghost, striking in ambushes, disappearing into the mist. Each victory was small, fleeting, unable to turn the tide, and always behind him loomed the shadow of betrayal. How many friends might be tempted by English gold? How many allies might whisper his hiding place into the ears of Edward's agents? By 1305, his world had narrowed to shadows and suspicion. The Lion of Stirling, once cheered by thousands, now stalked the edges of survival. His enemies multiplied not only in England, but in Scotland itself. Each night, as he lay down in some hidden glen, he must have wondered, which morning will I wake to the sound of chains? The seeds of doom were sown not by swords alone, but by envy, fear, and treachery. And Wallace, though still defiant, was already trapped in a web he could not see tightening. It happened not with a clash of swords, but with the quiet treachery of a trusted hand. In the summer of 1305, after years of fighting like a phantom, Wallace found himself cornered not by the armies of Edward, but by betrayal. The man's name was Sir John de Menteith, a fellow Scot, a noble who once swore allegiance to his own people, but who now bent his knee to England. To the world, he would be remembered with a single word: traitor. Imagine it. Wallace, weary from years of flight, seeks a moment's refuge near Glasgow. The forest that once sheltered him now conceal not friends, but hunters. Menteith, cloaking his treachery in gestures of trust, arranges the ambush. Perhaps Wallace sensed it, a flicker in the eyes of those around him, the unnatural stillness of a summer night. But before suspicion could harden into action, the trap was sprung. Iron struck flesh, chains snapped around wrists still calloused from battle. The lion was caught in a net. There was no trial of strength, no duel of blades, only the choking reality of capture. Wallace, who had defied Edward's armies for nearly a decade, was reduced in an instant to a prisoner. They wasted no time. Dragged across the border, shackled like an animal, he was paraded through English towns as if already defeated. The journey south was its own kind of torture. Jeering crowds spat at him. Rotten food and dung were hurled in his path. Every mile carried him farther from the wild glens of Scotland, deeper into the jaws of England's vengeance. To his captors, he was not just a man; they saw in him a symbol that must be crushed with the weight of spectacle. London awaited him, its streets crowded with those eager to glimpse the rebel whose name had haunted their king. The mighty tower loomed above the Thames, a fortress that had swallowed countless enemies of the crown. Now Wallace joined them, cast into its cold belly. Stone walls closed around him, walls that reeked of damp mould and despair. The man who once commanded thousands now slept on straw, his only company the drip of water and the shuffle of guards. Word spread quickly. On August 23rd, he was to face trial, not a trial in any true sense, but a stage set for humiliation. And beyond that trial lay a sentence so unspeakable that even the English whispered it with a mix of dread and fascination. Wallace's fall was complete. In a single betrayal, the mighty guardian of Scotland had been dragged from the heights of legend into the depths of captivity. His enemies had sprung their trap, and now all that remained was the descent, slow, deliberate, merciless, into the abyss of human cruelty. The Tower of London has many voices. Some whisper in the dark, others groan in the silence between footsteps, and some scream only in memory. For William Wallace, those voices were not merely echoes. They were chains of the mind binding him as securely as the iron shackles on his wrists. Picture him there in that damp cell. The walls sweating with moisture, the straw beneath him rank with mildew. He was not given the dignity of a warrior's prison. He was treated like a beast. His food, when it came, was little more than stale bread and foul water. The stench of rot hung heavy in the air, mingled with the faint smell of iron and smoke from the forges above. Rats scurried at the edges of the stone floor, their tiny claws scratching like whispers in the dark. But the true torment was not physical. It was silence, long, endless hours, where the mind gnawed at itself. The man who once thundered commands to thousands now had only his own thoughts for company. Did he wonder how Scotland fared without him? Did he curse the nobles who betrayed him? Or did he sit in quiet reflection, measuring his life against the fate he knew awaited him? Each possibility carried its own form of agony. At times, the silence was broken. Guards would drag him through the corridors, parading him like a trophy for visiting officials. Some spat upon him, others laughed, mocking the fallen giant. To the English crown, Wallace was no longer just a man, he was a symbol of defiance that needed to be humiliated, not merely destroyed. And perhaps in the darkest hours, he heard the whispers of betrayal echo louder than the jeers of his captors. John de Menteith, the Scot who had sold him, the lords who abandoned him at Falkirk, the allies who had melted away when England pressed too hard. Betrayal is a blade that never dulls. It cuts not just once, but again and again in the mind, each memory a fresh wound. What thoughts must have kept him awake in those sleepless nights? Did he replay Stirling Bridge, hearing once more the cries of victory, seeing the English fall into the river? Did he see in his mind's eye the villages he defended, the men who followed him, the brief glory of freedom? Or did he imagine in unbearable detail the death he knew was being prepared for him, a death unlike any soldier's end, crafted instead for the theatre of cruelty? Every creak of a door, every heavy footstep down the corridor could have been the signal it is time. And when it was not, the waiting itself became torture. Wallace was being broken long before a blade ever touched him. The tower was not simply a prison, it was an antechamber to despair, a place designed to strip away dignity layer by layer until nothing remained but fear. Yet by every account Wallace never begged. He did not surrender words of submission to his captors. Even in the depths of darkness he clung to silence, a silence that carried more defiance than any plea could have. And that silence perhaps unnerved his jailers more than screams ever would. In those long nights, William Wallace began his descent into darkness. And the deeper he fell, the more deliberate became the cruelty of those waiting above. His trial was approaching a performance already scripted, where justice would wear a mask and murder would wear the robes of law. The hall at Westminster was a stage, and William Wallace was cast as its villain. From the moment he was dragged in, shackled and gaunt from his weeks in the Tower, the outcome was already written. This was not a trial, it was theatre. The English crown had no intention of weighing justice, only of displaying power. Picture the scene, lords and officials gathered in their finery, banners of England draped from the walls, the air thick with the perfume of wealth and authority. Before them stood Wallace, a man who had no crown, no lineage, no seat at their tables. Yet his very presence had once shaken their king's dominion. To Edward I, this trial was not about a single man's guilt. It was about crushing the idea of Scotland itself. The charges were read aloud, each one pronounced with relish as though the words themselves could cut deeper than any blade. Treason, rebellion, murder. The list spilled on a litany crafted less from fact than from fury. The irony dripped like poison. Wallace was accused of treason against a king he had never sworn allegiance to. How he might have thought, can one betray a master one has never served? But in that hall, logic had no seat. Witnesses false bought or coerced spoke against him. He was painted not as a patriot, but as a monster, a savage who burned villages, slaughtered innocents, terrorized good English subjects. They twisted the truth of war into the lies of criminality. Every battle he fought for freedom was rebranded as butchery. Every act of resistance recast as barbarism. And yet, when Wallace was given a chance to speak, he did not beg. He did not grovel for mercy. Accounts say he denied the charge of treason outright, declaring he had never been England's subject. His voice hoarse from confinement carried enough fire to cut through the mockery. But in that hall, defiance was merely fuel for the spectacle. His words fell on ears that had been deaf long before he opened his mouth. The sentence came swiftly, coldly, as though rehearsed. William Wallace was to be dragged from the Tower through the streets of London, hanged until nearly dead, cut down, still breathing, his body ripped open, his entrails burned before his eyes. His head severed his body, quartered his remains, scattered to the winds of England's cities. It was not justice, it was annihilation. The lords nodded their approval. The scribes recorded the words as though they carried the weight of law. And the people in attendance whispered, some in satisfaction, others in unease, knowing they had witnessed not a trial, but a death sentence cloaked in ceremony. In that moment, Wallace's fate was sealed. His life no longer belonged to him, but to the cruelty of a king, determined to make him a lesson. The facade of justice had done its work, dressing vengeance in robes of legality. What remained was the execution, the true theatre. Edward had prepared a performance not for truth, but for terror. And so, with sentence pronounced, Wallace was returned to his cell. Outside London sharpened its knives, waiting for the day when his suffering would become a spectacle for the masses. Dawn broke slowly over London on August 23rd, 1305, its light pale and indifferent, spilling across the tower's grey stone. For William Wallace, that light was not the promise of a new day. It was the confirmation of his last, the final sunrise. The cell was cold, as it had always been, but the chill felt different now. It was no longer the endless cold of waiting. It was the precise chill of an ending. We do not know if Wallace was given food that morning. If he was, it would have been a bitter meal, not of sustenance but of ritual, a body's final offering, before it was broken. Perhaps he refused it. Perhaps he forced it down, knowing he would need what little strength remained. Accounts suggest he prayed. Others say he remained silent. But in either case, there is a weight to that silence, as though he was already speaking to something beyond the reach of his captors. Imagine him rising the iron around his wrists and ankles, biting into his skin as the guards pulled him to his feet. His body must have been gaunt, weakened by weeks of imprisonment, yet still bearing the traces of the warrior he had been. His hair unkempt, his beard ragged, his face lined not only with exhaustion, but with defiance. To the men who dragged him through the corridors, he was not just a prisoner, he was a symbol they had been ordered to extinguish. What thoughts must have carried him in those last hours? Did he see again the green hills of Elderslie where he was born? Did he hear once more the voices of his men at Stirling Bridge, crying out in victory? Did he remember the faces of friends lost, or the bitter sting of betrayal at Falkirk? Perhaps as dawn broke, he allowed himself one fleeting vision of Scotland free, a dream never realized in his life, but one that outlived him. They bound him to a wooden hurdle, a rough platform dragged behind horses. It was no accident, this was deliberate humiliation. A knight would be allowed to ride to his death. A noble might be carried in solemn procession. Wallace, the commoner who dared defy a king, was dragged like a carcass through the mud. As he was hauled from the Tower and out into the streets of London, the people gathered in droves. Some came to jeer, to spit, to hurl insults at the rebel. Others came out of grim curiosity, drawn by the promise of a spectacle. Children clambered onto walls, merchants abandoned their stalls, and the air filled with the restless energy of a city about to feed on cruelty. Yet among the noise, there must have been silence too. A silence in the hearts of some who looked upon this man and saw not a monster, but a warrior walking into the jaws of death with his head unbowed. A silence that trembled with unspoken admiration, though no one dared voice it aloud. As the sun rose higher, William Wallace faced his last day, not as a supplicant, not as a broken man, but as a soldier bound for the final battle. A battle not of swords and shields, but of flesh against the unrelenting theatre of pain. And still he did not beg. The crowd was already restless when the horses pulled Wallace's hurdle into Smithfield. Dust rose in choking clouds as thousands pressed forward, each face twisted by curiosity, contempt, or bloodlust. The summer air stank of sweat, of smoke, of anticipation thick enough to suffocate. At the centre of it all, dragged through the filth, was William Wallace, his body battered, his dignity stripped, but his spirit impossibly still intact. The first act began with the rope. They lifted him to the gallows, tying the noose tightly around his neck. The crowd roared, surging like a living thing. The executioner kicked the support away, and Wallace's body dropped. His throat seized his chest, convulsed. His face darkened as life struggled against the choking cord. The sound was ghastly, the creak of rope, the rasp of strangled breath, the roar of the mob. He swung there, twisting just long enough for death to brush his cheek, but not long enough to claim him. The rope slackened. He was cut down, coughing, still alive. This was no mercy. It was the beginning. Dragged again before the crowd, Wallace was stripped further, his body pinned to the block. What came next was not execution, it was degradation. Before the eyes of thousands, the executioner mutilated him, tearing away that which marked him as a man. The crowd gasped, some cheering, others turning pale. Blood ran dark over the wood. For many, this would have been the breaking point. But Wallace, though his body convulsed, did not cry out. His silence became a defiance louder than any scream. Then came the knife. With deliberate cruelty, the executioner cut into his abdomen, opening him inch by inch. The smell was unbearable hot blood, entrails, the iron tang of life itself spilling into the air. The pain must have been beyond comprehension, each nerve shrieking as if on fire. Piece by piece, his insides were torn from him, held up before the jeering masses, then fed into the flames. Imagine the horror of it, watching your own body, burned smoke, curling upward as if mocking the soul still trapped in flesh. Through it all, Wallace remained conscious. They wanted him broken, begging, humiliated. But every account whispers the same truth he endured. Whether by stubborn strength or by some final gift of fate, his spirit refused to yield even as his body was dismantled. At last the blade rose again, this time to sever his head. The stroke came swift, almost merciful compared to what had preceded it. In that instant, the ordeal ended, the man was gone, though his body's torment was not yet finished. His head was raised aloft, dripping, displayed as proof of the king's victory. The roar of the crowd thundered not with respect, but with the frenzy of those who had gorged themselves on horror. But Edward's vengeance was not satisfied. Wallace's body was quartered, limbs hacked away, each piece destined for a different corner of England: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. His head was spiked on London Bridge, a grim sentinel for all who entered the city. It was a spectacle designed not only to kill, but to erase, to degrade, to terrify. And yet, even in its cruelty, it failed, for no matter how many pieces they scattered, William Wallace did not vanish. His body was torn apart, but his defiance lived on in silence, in memory, in the hearts of those who would carry the fight long after his last breath. The roar of the crowd lingered only for moments. Then came the silence, an eerie, unsettled quiet that clung to Smithfield like smoke after a fire. Thousands had gathered to watch, to revel in the destruction of a man. But when the final act was complete, when Wallace's body lay in pieces, something shifted. What had been anticipation and bloodlust curdled into a heaviness that no one could quite name. The executioners busied themselves with grisly precision. His severed head, still dripping, was mounted on a pike carried toward London Bridge, where it would leer over the Thames as a warning. His limbs, wrapped for transport, would be sent north, morbid trophies, to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. This was no ordinary disposal. It was a message carved in flesh, an anatomy of terror meant to echo across Britain. Some in the crowd cheered, their voices sharp, almost desperate, as though to convince themselves they had witnessed justice. Others turned away pale, sickened by the spectacle. Children clung to their mothers, their faces pressed into skirts to avoid the sight of blood pooling on the cobblestones. Merchants who had closed shop to watch quietly slipped back to their stalls. Their laughter muted their eyes, avoiding one another. A handful of voices still cursed Wallace, but their jeers sounded hollow in the heavy air. Among the English lords, satisfaction glimmered coldly. They had witnessed not merely a man's death, but the obliteration of a symbol. To them, Wallace was no longer a threat, no longer a rallying point for rebellion. His head would rot above the Thames, his body would hang in quarters, and his name, so they believed, would fade into silence. Edward fate had struck not only at a man, but at an idea, and the theatre of cruelty was meant to assure his audience that the crown always triumphed. And yet, silence speaks louder than cheers. Beneath the surface of victory, unease lingered. Some could not shake the image of Wallace's defiance, his refusal to beg his silence, even as his body was torn apart. The cruelty had been absolute, but had it been too much? Did it reveal the crown's strength or its fear? The streets emptied slowly. The scaffold was washed, but the stains would never fully fade. London Bridge soon bore Wallace's head, its grim grin greeting all who entered the city. Travellers who crossed beneath it would look up and feel the weight of its warning. Yet some, especially those from the north, looked not with fear, but with sorrow and with anger. And in the stillness, after the screams, a truth lingered in the air, unspoken, but undeniable. Though his body had been scattered, William Wallace was not gone. The silence that followed his execution was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence before a storm. History did not end at Smithfield. Though Edward I believed he had crushed a rebellion with one man's body, he had instead forged a martyr whose shadow would outlive him. The echoes of William Wallace's execution did not fade with the smoke of his burning entrails. They spread, carried north on the lips of travellers, whispered in Scottish taverns, murmured by mothers to children who would grow into the next generation of rebels. In Scotland, his death was not seen as a criminal's punishment, but as a hero's sacrifice. The common people who had no titles or lands, but who bore the weight of English conquest on their backs, clung to his memory. Wallace became more than flesh and blood. He became legend. They spoke of him not as the man butchered in London, but as the warrior who once drove an English army into the river at Stirling. His silence at the scaffold became louder than any plea for mercy could have been. His suffering, designed to humiliate, became proof of his unyielding strength. Edward's cruelty had achieved the opposite of its intent. By scattering Wallace's body, he scattered seeds. A few years later, those seeds would bloom in the rise of Robert the Bruce, who would carry forward the cause of Scottish independence. And though victory would come slowly and painfully, the spirit of resistance could always be traced back to Wallace, the man torn apart but never erased. Even beyond Scotland, his fate burned itself into memory. Chroniclers wrote of it, sometimes with satisfaction, sometimes with horror. In time, the story of Wallace's execution would become one of the most notorious examples of medieval cruelty. The English crown had staged his death as a warning, But centuries later, it is not Edward III who is remembered with reverence, it is Wallace. The very brutality designed to annihilate him ensured his immortality. And what of Edward? The hammer of the Scots, the mighty king feared by nations. He would die only 2 years later, in 1307 on campaign in the north, still obsessed with subduing the land Wallace had fought to free. His great power could crush bodies, scatter armies and burn villages, but it could not conquer memory. The crown that ordered Wallace's execution now lies in the dust of history, while Wallace's name is carved in stone, sung in songs, and immortalized in legend. So we are left with a haunting question. What is true power? Is it the might to destroy a man's body, to silence his voice, to scatter his remains across the land? Or is it the ability of one man broken and dismembered to live forever in the defiant heartbeat of a nation? William Wallace's end was a nightmare of fire, steel and blood. Yet his echo is not silence. His echo is the cry that still stirs in the soul of every people who dare resist tyranny. You may kill the man, but you cannot kill the idea.